to the illicit consecrations of the bishops. Can you just maybe slow down and just break this open for us so we can understand what happened?
Right. We defined what schism is, right? It's the withdrawal of submission to, the Holy Father, to his jurisdiction, his authority. And, we can say that, certainly a case can be made that Archbishop Lefebvre withdrew submission from Paul VI and John Paul II by disregarding all canonical warnings, by disregarding all canonical censures. But it finally, Matt, led to the definitive rupture, because the canonical crime of schism results in automatic excommunication, okay? Schism is defined in Canon 751. Under Canon 1364, those who commit the canonical crime of schism are automatically excommunicated from the church. It's called late sententiae. By the act itself, the sentence is already passed if the act is committed. The issue with that, though, is you really don't have what's called juridical certainty of who incurred the censure without the church declaring it.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't name people, I warn people. There's a difference. What I'm saying is what the popes have said, those who adhere to this schism formally will incur automatic excommunication. Again, Matt, I don't name who they are because we're not the authority to determine whether the canonical elements were met. The church is, but that doesn't mean nobody's excommunicated. The fact is, unlike civil law or criminal law where a defendant actually has to be tried and convicted before he is sentenced, there are acts under canonical or ecclesiastical law where the sentence is passed by virtue of the fact that you committed the act. Heresy, apostasy, and schism results in automatic excommunication. I bring that up because while an argument can be made that Archbishop Lefebvre was already excommunicated for schism based upon this 13, 14-year repudiation of papal authority, still wasn't declared yet, right? There's still that element of juridical uncertainty as to whether he did. Well, that changed when he went forward and illicitly consecrated the 4 bishops on June 30, 1988. He was warned not to do this. Remember now, he was given a bishop by John Paul II, and he reneged. What Lefebvre came out and said is, you know what, I rethought my position. I don't want 1 bishop on August 15th. I want 4 bishops on June 30th. So I want 3 more 6 weeks early. Why?
He said this to the Holy Father?
Well, this is practically what he presented because that's what he ended up doing. He told Ratzinger, if you read the correspondence, which was another thing that really disturbed me when I started reading the correspondence with Cardinal Ratzinger and Archbishop Lefebvre, Rome was bending over backwards for him. And I even wondered why. Why were they so docile to this man who has rejected everything that they've commanded him to do for a dozen years? But it got to a point where Lefebvre has decided that he's going to go forward with these illicit consecrations. He was canonically warned that if he did so, he would be excommunicated. He went forward with the consecrations. And then Cardinal Ganton of the Congregation for Bishops declared that he had incurred this automatic censure of excommunication under 1364. His declaration is not imposing it. He's declared that it's already happened, okay? And then John Paul II then, Matt, came out with Ecclesia Dei Afflicta on July 2nd, the very next day, 1988, and solemnly confirmed
the church
that
really moves that quickly.
Solemnly confirmed that Lefebvre had excommunicated himself. Now, we can explain why that is, and very briefly, I will just say, it's because, and John Paul II even says this in Ecclesia Dei Afflicta, it's because what Lefebvre did is a rejection of the Roman primacy, a usurpation of the Roman primacy. This is a very important point that I want all our society friends to understand. As I did my research on this and reading the encyclicals, particularly a number of encyclicals from Pius IX, who during his pontificate addressed many illicit consecrations during his pontificate. What he and others have taught, I can go to Pius VI, Pius IX, Pius XII, the Council of Trent, on and on and on. The magisterium has taught that just as Christ alone chose his apostles, so the vicar of Christ alone chooses the successors to the apostles. You see, just as Christ alone sends the apostles, so the vicar of Christ alone sends the apostles. It is a right of the Roman primacy, of the Roman pontiff who holds the office of the primacy. It is his sole and exclusive right to select, consecrate, and send bishops. That is a matter of divine law. When one consecrates a bishop contrary to the will of the Holy Father, they are usurping a right of the Roman primacy. You see, Pius VI, Pius IX says, Christ himself gave this right to Peter, to the office of Peter. This is a right that Christ himself is conferring upon the office of the primacy. That's how serious this is. You see, this was a weakness in Michael Davies' argument, may he rest in peace, right? He was an apologist for the society. And, he always referred to the fact that Archbishop Lefebvre didn't have an apostolic mandate to consecrate these bishops, and you don't need an apostolic mandate. You didn't in the early church, and not having an apostolic mandate isn't necessarily schismatic. That's true. Okay. In the early church, we didn't have this notion of apostolic mandate. A lot of times, especially in the East, bishops were just consecrated, always with the tacit approval of the Pope, never contrary to the will of the Pope. There's a difference. But there's also a difference, Matt, between consecrating a bishop without an apostolic mandate, which now under the Code of Canon Law is an offense that's subject to excommunication. That's not necessarily a schismatic act, though. Okay, we can bring up cases where Cardinal Wojtyła, when he was cardinal behind the Iron Curtain, he had consecrated evidently some bishops. Right. Bishop Slippage.
Is this in Ukraine?
It was in that area in the east somewhere behind the Iron Curtain. And he didn't have an apostolic mandate. Now, why wasn't that schismatic?
Good question.
Well, the answer is because the Holy See said it wasn't. Because the Holy See accepted the consecrations, because they recognized that there were unique facts and circumstances there. It's ironic because Karol Wojtyła became Pope John Paul II. So he, of course, above anybody, would have known what necessity is all about, wouldn't he have? He, in fact, engaged in this very practice himself. But what he said, and this was not the situation behind the Iron Curtain, there was not a canonical warning not to do what he did. In Lefebvre's case, he was warned that we offered you one, you're now taking three more. No, this is contrary to the will of the Holy Father. If you do this, this is why Ecclesia de Afflicta, in one of the paragraphs, says, this constitutes a rejection of the Roman primacy. Okay? Now, we're not talking about ecclesiastical or human law here. This is what's so important, Matt. As I said, this is a matter of divine law. You can't get around this. The Pope alone has the right to select and consecrate and send bishops. Of course, he delegates the act of the episcopal consecration to bishops. That's something that he can delegate and often does delegate to other bishops. But they don't have a right to do it against his will. Okay, it's the Pope who decides who's going to enter into the College of Bishops because he's the head. You see, a bishop cannot enter into the College of Bishops against the will of the head of the college. It's absurd. It's absurd. This is the church. This is the church that Christ founded. And when we talk about the church, we primarily mean those two divine institutions that Christ gave us, the primacy of Peter and the episcopate, the College of Bishops. Those are the divine organs of the church that are directly created and instituted by Christ himself. And so this is why any usurpation or misappropriation of a right that only belongs to the Pope is necessarily schismatic. And I can think of nothing more serious other than a man claiming he's the Pope when he's an anti-Pope. Because when you're talking about usurping a right of the primacy, which regards the perpetuation of apostolic succession, okay, and the church's mission until the second coming. You don't get any more serious than that. We're talking about the divine constitution of the church here. This is why what Lefebvre did wasn't necessarily schismatic, because it was an attack on that divine constitution.
How does the FSSPX make an argument for these consecrations? I think a sign of a good intellect, I think it was Aristotle, he said you can entertain an idea without having to accept it. Can you try to steel man as opposed to straw man? Can you try to steel man the society's arguments for why Lefebvre was correct in ordaining these bishops, even though you don't agree with it.
The entire tradition of the church doesn't agree with it. As I've said, I have an article where I cite all the popes who have condemned this practice. They'll say
what
two things.
What do they say then? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the society will say two things. One, they'll say a necessity allows us to do so. Now, the problem with that, Matt, is that necessity never justifies the circumvention of divine law. It only could justify the circumvention of ecclesiastical or human law. Apoiá, might be an example where the law would be suspended because we want to fulfill a higher law. So, the will of the legislature based upon these ecclesiastical laws, if the circumstances frustrate the higher law, Apoiá would say those laws are suspended, we can appeal to the higher law. The problem with the society's position is that the right to select and consecrate a bishop is part of the divine law. It is part of the higher law, just as is canonical mission. The fact that the mission of the salvation of souls takes place through the right of the Pope to perpetuate the episcopate through the selection and consecration and mission of his bishops. So, in fact, what I'm saying is exactly what the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts declared in 1996. That's the organ of the church that's responsible for giving definitive judgments on canon law, the meaning of canon law, and the PCILT said specifically that necessity never justifies consecrating a bishop contrary to the will of the Holy Father. Okay, contrary to the will of the Holy Father. It's impossible.
So do you think Lefebvre was hoping that John Paul II would have recognized these after the fact as legitimate consecrations?
There's no way he could have, because he was warned in advance that if he did so, he'd be excommunicated.
Okay, so then what happens next? What happens to Lefebvre and these other bishops?
Well, they were then declared to have incurred the automatic latae sententiae censure of excommunication by committing a schismatic act. The schismatic act, as I said, was this rejection of the primacy, this usurpation of a right that only Peter and his successors holds. And then John Paul II said that not only was this a schismatic act, but the society is in schism, and anyone who formally adheres to the schism is excommunicated. Now, there's a distinction I think we need to make between the SSPX and the people, right? Yeah. Because the society as a tax-exempt organization, whatever you want to call it, right? I mean, that it can't be excommunicated, but the people can be. People are subject to the censure of excommunication, not the society per se. However, the popes have used the word schism to apply to the society because it is a movement. Remember, I said it's not technically a juridic person under canon law because it was suppressed. It doesn't exist. It's just a conglomeration of acephalous priests. It is a movement that is schismatic because the act that gave birth to this so-called mission now was a schismatic act, and everything that flows from it, all the ordinations and everything they do from that would be considered part of the schism.
I see.
Okay. So, Cardinal Burke, well, first of all, John Paul II has referred to the society as in schism. Benedict XVI did. Even Pope Francis did. People aren't aware of that.
Yeah, when he issued
Traditionis Custodes, he referred to, I think in his letter to the bishops accompanying TC, he referred to, quote, the schism of Monsignor Lefebvre.
Could he not have been referring to the schism that happened in the past but since been cleared up?
Well, the schism hasn't been cleared up. Only the censures that were declared were removed. But the act, we'll get to that.
Is there a quick list of documents you can give me that I can throw in the description for people to follow along with? Because I've noticed you've cited a couple documents. Is there a quick list you could give me?
Not off the top of our head, maybe, but maybe after the fact.
Ecclesia Dei Afflicta.
Oh, you're going to put links to them. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
What a man.
Yeah, July 2nd, 1988, Ecclesia Dei Afflicta, which was the motu proprio of John Paul II, whereby he declared that Lefebvre and the four bishops that received episcopal consecration against the will of the Holy Father had incurred the automatic censure of excommunication. Okay. And then, as we were getting into, Matt, there's a distinction, right, between the movement, which is clearly schismatic, as all the popes have said, as Cardinal Burke has said, as Cardinal Mueller has said, Cardinal Ratzinger, and so forth, and the people who adhere to the movement. So, that distinction is persons are subject to the censure. So, in my opinion, we know that Benedict has lifted the censure of excommunication on the 4 bishops. Okay.
What does that mean? How could he do that? They were deceased at the time, correct?
No, they're all still alive.
No, I mean
Lefebvre.
I meant.
Well, he didn't lift it on Lefebvre. He mentioned the 4 bishops.
I see.
Right. Lefebvre was deceased, but he mentioned the four bishops. Well, if you read the decree that lifts the censure of excommunication, it's clear that Pope Benedict did it because it says he wanted to, quote, have prompt attainment of full communion with the church. Because the 4 bishops were under a declared censure, okay? We know it happened automatically, but when the church comes in and actually declares it, that's considered a juridical obstacle toward communion.
I see.
If the censure wasn't declared, let's say you or I, God forbid, incurred the censure of excommunication, but the church didn't declare it, all we would need to do is go to a confessor who had the faculty to absolve and lift the censure, and we'd be back in. You see? When the censure is declared, that is an additional juridical impediment toward full communion. So Benedict says, I'm going to remove the impediment, okay, that's preventing full communion so that you promptly attain full communion. And then what happened after he lifted the censure? Remember, that's when the society theologians, went in and had these debates with the Roman theologians about the various doctrinal issues that they needed to resolve. And guess what happened? Nothing got resolved. The society came out on the back end of that in exactly the same position that they were in 1988, and that they were in 2009, and that they were in 2012, and that they are in 2023, other than delegated faculties for confessions, which we can talk about. But the society, given all these overtures, they haven't changed their position at all. They actually, at the back end of this, Matt, in 2012, I think it was April 15th of 2012, they were given a protocol. Bishop Fillet was given a protocol. We mentioned it, right? Except, that the new Mass was at least legitimately promulgated by the Holy Father, and that the council documents are from a true ecumenical council and can be interpreted with tradition. The society rejected those conditions, those reasonable conditions, which would have, I believe, brought them into communion with the church. I think they could have been given
I would suspect many people
personal pleasure. Well, and this is where the resistance
I think a lot of
then
people
broke
wouldn't know
off.
this. Even people attending SSPX
I know.
may not know this.
It's shocking. You can go look at the protocol. I mean, I read it recently. I'm thinking, man, they had everything they wanted. What happened? What happened there?
So when somebody says, you've just explained this, but one more time, when somebody says Pope Benedict lifted the excommunications, ergo the SSPX are no longer in schism.
And that's not true, because I'll give you an example. Pope Paul VI lifted the excommunications on the Orthodox. Are they still in schism? The Society of St. Pius X would be the first to say that the Orthodox are still in schism, even though the excommunications are lifted. You see?
But the SSPX mention Pope Francis at the liturgy. They claim to be under him. The Orthodox don't. They're clearly, if you want to say they're not in communion, they're clearly more in communion than, if you can be more in communion, than the Orthodox.
Well,
or closer to communion.
Pius IX and Leo XIII both have said that a mere profession of unity is insufficient for the legal reality. And again, this is what I've been talking about when we talk about errors of ecclesiology. Just because they mention Pope Francis in the canon doesn't mean that they are in communion with the Roman Catholic Church and juridically united to her in faith, worship, and governance. And I can prove that by pointing out, Matt, to the old Catholics, the old Catholic Confederation. Look it up online.
For those at home, who are they? When did they?
They broke off from the church after Vatican I because they didn't like the definition of papal infallibility. So they have their own schism and their own illicit ordinations, and they still exist today. And I just was very curious to watch an old Catholic Mass because I wanted to know, will they mention Francis in the canon? They do.
And the SSPX would agree that they're in schism.
Absolutely, 100%.
So mentioning Pope Francis at Holy Mass isn't enough.
Pius IX excommunicated the old Catholics. They're clearly in schism. Another reason why, Matt, you can clearly show the societies in schism is because they're willfully separated from the church's governance. This is also something that I don't hear my friendly opponents talk about. This is very important. We talk about divine law, the fact that it is a matter of divine law that the Pope alone chooses his bishops, that the Pope alone gives canonical mission to the bishops who then send the priests. Well, it's also a matter of divine law that one must be united to the government of the Catholic Church. Pope Leo XIII teaches this very clearly in Satis Cognitum. He says being part of the Church's governance is de jure divino. It's divine law. And yet the society leadership will admit, and they must admit, that they have decided to remain separated, legally separated from the church's governance. They're not subject to the church's governance. That's another clear sign